I bought The Witcher 3 back in 2015 upon its release. Having relatively recently played through The Witcher 2 again and being consequently rather enthused about the sequel and having a lot of trust into CDPR at the time, I even did something rather unusual for me. I purchased the Season Pass, or whatever it was called at the time on GOG. Since I was also in a financially rather solid situation at the time, I went full decadent and bought myself the limited edition physical Gwent decks. I will admit that was an act of utter self-indulgence, but honestly, given how much CDPR sank the standalone Gwent card game, that might accidentally have turned out to be a rather prudent investment after all. Now, I didn't start playing The Witcher 3 immediately, and the reason were twofold. On the one hand, having bought the Season Pass, and therefore knowing that there would be 2 DLCs at least coming further down the pipe, I thought to myself, well, if I wait a little bit, I might as well just enjoy the entirety of the game. And on the other hand, the Witcher games are one of the few that allow you to transfer save files between different titles. So I decided, why not enjoy the entirety of the franchise in one fell swoop? So I started up The Witcher 1 once again, played through it in its entirety, and not in a speedrun or rushing manner, no, I enjoyed myself. Then started up The Witcher 2, transferred my save file, played through that game in the exact same comfortable and enjoying fashion, and then I started up The Witcher 3, transferred my save file there, watched the intro, and realized 2 major things. Number 1, my machine at the time wasn't quite up to the task, and secondly, I got kind of sick of The Witcher. Consequently, I took a bit of a Witcher hiatus. That lasted until, I'd like to say, between 2017 and 2018. Started the game up, played through the White Orchard prologue. Oh, no, that's not actually true. I played about half an hour into that prologue. Genuinely liked what I saw at first glance, and then got once more distracted by real life issues. The result of all of that is that I finally played through the entire main game of The Witcher 3 in this very year. Yes, I bought a game in 2015 at full price, including the Season Pass, and ultimately played it from January to February of 2022. But my tardiness aside, I was actually still rather looking forward to playing that game. After all, as I said, the first impression was good, and while the game was always a rather overhyped title, whether it was on the side of professional game journalists, independent content creators, i.e. influencers, i.e. paid shills, or of course CDPR themselves, after 7 years, the general consensus was still that this was a really good, if not outright amazing game, so I was positively surprised. But when I finally played through this game, I realized that this game had some rather major issues, and I'm not talking about glitches or bugs. Due to the fact that I played this game in the current version 1.32, I missed out on a lot of the more grave and hilarious bugs, like Geralt breaking his legs when he jumps so much as 1 meter into the air. And in all honesty, I'm not entirely sure if that's a good or a bad thing. No, what I'm talking about are some real major league issues that are ingrained into the game's very basic design, and what was even more frustrating to me is that I could hear nobody, not even people who were outspokenly critical, even overzealously in their criticism of that game, would even mention these things. But thankfully it's 2022, it's the internet, and I have a new microphone to test out that I don't know how to handle, so why not do such a video myself? Now, there are a few things that I want to establish ahead of the video proper. First and foremost, that this video will be highly critical by design. This is not one of my reviews, and this video's purpose is not to give the game a fair shake. So if you expect me to do the, I don't know, that guy with the glasses / Dark Walker thing where I criticize something, then at the end name a few nice things and come to magnificently insightful conclusions like, I guess we have to agree to disagree. Yeah, this is not going to be this kind of video. Also, you're clearly new here. No, the purpose of this video will be, well, yeah, sure, to partially vent my frustrations with it, but I promise you there is a bigger point waiting for you towards the end, so indulge me on this one. But general gist is, this video will be one of those negative videos overall. But don't worry, I will occasionally pat you on the back, Witcher fans. And to immediately make myself sound like a fucking schizophrenic, the second point is that regardless of how critical I will be of this game, and regardless of how livid I might become when it comes to very specific aspects of it, I actually still genuinely enjoyed and liked The Witcher 3. As a matter of fact, if this were a review, it would more than likely end up in the A class of my personal ranking system, meaning that I would recommend it for purchase even at full price, at least to fans of the genre. Now, I know at the mention of the word genre there will be some people, or there might be some people, who will immediately start typing furiously. Stop. Take your fingers from the keyboard. I know. I will get to this. Trust me on this one. Alright? Just put a pin into that point. We'll get there later. For now, the important part is that for all the criticism I will level at The Witcher 3, at the end of the day I still think it is a very good game, and it is a game that I personally would recommend to people. Thirdly, there will be many points, many examples for these points, and probably a few arguments that many of you might believe should be in this video, and I might even agree with this point, but they will end up on the proverbial cutting room floor all the same. The reason for that is very simple. I want to keep this video as short as I can possibly can. Now, usually when I make videos, I aim for a 30-45 minute duration. I think that's a good duration for the kind of video I make. However, given the sheer size of The Witcher 3 and, well, the complexity of the topic here, even in my most optimistic predictions, I don't see that happening. Realistically speaking, I guess this will go between the 1 hour, 1.5 hour mark, but I'll make no promises. All the same, I'm not Mauler, and I don't intend to make a fucking 10-hour dissection of every single facet. So, if you find yourself wondering why I don't bring up a certain point, or why I don't mention a certain scene, it is likely that I'm aware of what you're talking or thinking about, but for brevity's sake I decided to focus on 1, maybe 2 crucial points and just hope that they will get the point across sufficiently. The fourth point. When it comes to the story of this game, or the characters therein, I will completely and utterly disregard the books. There are numerous reasons for that, but I think the most prevalent and the most rational of them is that the author of the novels, Andrzej Sapkowski, repeatedly and decidedly rejected the games as canon. He himself, I'm fairly certain I remember, said that while the characters and the stories are obviously inspired and in several instances overlap with the stories of his books, are their own separate thing. Not that his statement would have been needed for that, after all, the entire story of the first Witcher game starts with the event that in the books marks the death of both Geralt and Yennefer. Now on the other side, CDPR are unquestionably fans of the books, for some reason, and despite making several references to the books, especially in this game, where, among many other scenes kind of like that, there's one conversation between Geralt and Yennefer during the Last Wish quest that upon hearing my wife actually said reminded her eerily of the elevator conversation between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker in episode 2.
I haven't felt you this tense since we fell into that nest of gundogs.
You fell into that nightmare, Master, and I rescued you, remember?
Oh, Yes.
Despite that, CDPR themselves have insisted that, the games are their own isolated story. It's basically their version of Geralt of Rivia and his adventures. And furthermore, on numerous occasions throughout all of the games, they intentionally deviate from events and characterizations as they are presented in the books. Again, I could name numerous examples, but for brevity's sake, you could just consider the character of Triss Merigold, who in the games has a different hair color, different eye colors, is missing a rather significant feature on her body, and if we're being brutally honest, also has a very, very different personality and a slightly more healthy relationship to the protagonist of Geralt. Consequently, I don't see much reason to start the debate of whether a characterization in the book is relevant to the games. I will stick to the games themselves since this is my main focus. But since I've touched upon them now, and someone will probably ask at some point, what are my opinions on the books? Well, in advance I admit that I have never read any of the Witcher books in their entirety. I've read some excerpts, especially from The Last Wish and I think Sword of Destiny it's called. I've read plenty, oh my god, so many synopsises over the last 10 plus years when I looked up characters, backgrounds and references, so I've learned more than I wagered to know. And whenever I thought those two sources to be insufficient or not satisfying in their responses, I actually consulted my wife, who herself has read 3 of the books, my condolences for that, and whom I trust almost blindly on these issues. On the one hand, because, well, she is a published German author, and also because in the 10 plus years that we have known each other, she has proven herself impressively insightful, some might outright say prophetic, when it comes to the qualitative future of several franchises, be it in literary form, video games, or movies and or TV shows. So as much as I like to pride myself with not easily falling for hype and marketing, and often seeing the writing on the wall when it comes to the creative or qualitative future of certain franchises, I have to admit that I have absolutely nothing on that woman in that regard, who in that context has proven herself more often than she ever would have needed to. And based on all of that, my opinion is, quite frankly, the books are shit. And the more I actually read of the books, that's the wonderful thing, the more excerpts I read, the more passages I come across, my opinion of the books actually worsens. Even if we're putting aside the clear inspiration from a certain Michael Moorcock franchise, I honestly think that the books are just plain badly written, including asinine names and absolutely stupid plots, like Geralt fighting a fucking dumpling monsters, names like Dudu or Duny or fucking Vilgefortz, and of course the origin story of Duny / Emeva Emreis as a literal fucking hedgehog knight. Yes, he's a humanoid hedgehog. Can't imagine why that isn't mentioned in The Witcher 3. Furthermore, the series are full with wish fulfillment characters. The protagonist of Geralt of Rivia, who in contrast to the later games, in the books is described as pale and corpse-like, and yet for some reason the women in that universe just can't seem to help themselves but spread their legs for him. Must be his sense of humor. What makes this even worse is that usually I can say I don't like a franchise, but I can at least respect the effort of the author, but Andrzej Sapkowski is kind of a fucking cunt. Not only did he rather dismiss the Witcher gaming franchise when it was still relatively small or relatively niche, upon becoming mainstream popular with The Witcher 3, Sapkowski suddenly went so far as considering to sue CDPR so that he could strike a better, more profitable licensing deal for giving CDPR the publishing rights for anything Witcher related. I don't know if he actually did it, I lost interest to be honest, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. This guy actually now, as far as I can tell, even went so far as deluding himself into believing that the games are only popular because of his books. I'll just leave it at that and summarize it as following. I think the books are shit, and I think that Sapkowski is a fat, bloated, greedy, narcissistic, plagiarizing, talentless cunt. So, after I finished alienating at least half of all Witcher fans and probably half the nation of Poland, let's finally get into the video proper. Now, there are two more specific categories in which I think The Witcher 3 fails on a basic design level, but I want to start out with something more vague and general that in my opinion permeates every single facet of this game, from gameplay to storytelling to mechanics. Because in my opinion, The Witcher 3, for all its praise it gotten and still gets, as far as its design is concerned, is surprisingly and stunningly shallow and is lacking an impressive amount of focus. Now, in order to properly exemplify what I mean by that, I want to first mention something about the game that I genuinely like, what I consider to be one of the major reasons why I actually enjoy and recommend The Witcher 3. And that is that, at least at the time of this recording, I cannot recall any game that I've ever played or seen that actually simulates the life of a professional monster hunter. Now, I'm fully aware that there are billions of games in which you fight and kill monsters. Hell, I'm even aware that there's an entire franchise that's called Monster Hunter. But if you're being brutally honest, that game is rather some kind of Dark Souls-esque kill the big enemy kind of game. Now, what I'm talking about is the simulation of, well, what it would be like to be a monster hunter as a profession in a medieval fantasy world. So in The Witcher 3, you ride from village to village. You listen to villagers about what kind of problems they have. You go to the notice board in the village, pick out your favorite or most appealing monster contract. Then you contact the contract giver. You try to piece together by his descriptions and the leads what kind of a monster you're dealing with. You negotiate how much your pay will be for this contract. You're tracking the monster down, you're identifying it, you prepare for combat, you dissect it for its rare and valuable resources, pick up a trophy, ride back into the village, cash in your money, and ride off into the sunset, with occasional monster contracts leading to more complex and interesting stories, and sometimes even coming across a situation where you think that it is more valuable for everyone for the monster to either survive, or the monster and the humans even to get along, despite the fact that usually your profession demands you to kill monsters. Now, your personal mileage may vary, but to me that sounds like a really good game. Really interesting game. Might not even need a overblown and actually kind of needless main storyline, right? But of course there's a catch to this entire story, otherwise we wouldn't be here. See, the point is, while the general description of what I just gave you does indeed sound very compelling, and in very general terms that is what you do in The Witcher 3, the actual execution in the game is less than exciting. So, when we revisit the scenario I just described, yes, you do actually ride from village to village. That part, at least, is true, and it is a beautiful, big, and interesting world, or interesting landscape, with a lot of avenues to explore. The problems start from everything up till there. First off, hearing villagers complain about their ailments in everyday conversations. Personally, I think I've come across 2, maybe 3 occasions of that. The most prominent one being in the city of Oxenford, where people talked about how they found corpses recently in the city that were drained of, I think, a lot or all of their blood. It's a vampire. Spoilers, I guess. But you can never actually talk to these civilians. You can never start the quest by picking up a conversation like that. Although never is not exactly correct. There is one quest in a small village which ultimately leads you to discover Geralt's old friend, the witch or the sorceress Kira Metz, who works as a village witch nearby, where 2 ladies are gossiping with each other, and if you stand by and listen to them, you can pick up where that witch you're looking for is. If you, however, talk to these two girls and ask them directly, hey, what's that about the witch you're talking about? They will shut down, and that optional part of the quest will be deemed as failed. The problem, however, is that happens once. Otherwise, yeah, not so much. Basically, if you're lucky to hear civilians talk about a current problem, that's all you can do. Same thing in essence with the notice boards. You usually find 2, maybe 3 actual monster contracts on each notice board, with the occasional exception, of course. The other notices on the board are usually just fluff pieces to flesh out the world for the sake of atmosphere and stuff like that. The thing is that usually there is no reason whatsoever to only accept one of those monster contracts. Either you take all of them, or if you're already past the level of these quests, you just leave them be. Or leave all of them be, I mean. There really is never any reason to say, okay, I picked this quest, but this quest, not so much. A way in which I think this could have been handled better is if they actually put some kind of, I don't know, time limit to certain monster quests. Like, and I'm just spitballing here, if one of the invading parties in the overarching war of the setting, you know, Redania against Nilfgaard, was slowly progressing and taking in settlements. There actually is a mechanic someone like this, in which Geralt can liberate abandoned villages and ports from monsters, which occasionally results in Redanian or Nilfgaardian soldiers taking over that place and using it as some kind of impromptu command post or something along those lines. And as the game progresses, you could have made it so that certain monster contracts, specifically monsters that are a bit harder to kill for a single Witcher, would have been killed by the advancing military forces who just, you know, didn't want their new outpost and the surrounding villages to be constantly overrun with monsters. Therefore, you could have easier contracts that would have been available pretty much throughout the entirety of the game, minor nuisances that only occasionally inconvenience the villagers, which however only result in a small amount of XP and a small payday, whereas you could also get rather difficult and risky monster contracts, which would be harder to do at the respective level, but if you do, you would get more money, more experience, and a good chance for finding really good equipment. However, those are only available as long as the advancing armies haven't taken care of the problem for you. This would also thematically play into a topic that has been touched back in The Witcher 1, that Witchers essentially become obsolete with the advancement of technology and the establishment of organized armies. A similar problem we face when it comes to the whole negotiating your pay aspect when talking to the contract giver. Yeah, you could have done something nice about it, like, I don't know, based on the notice and the things that the contract giver tells you, maybe even based on leads you might have picked up before talking to the contract giver, what kind of monster you're actually chasing, and depending on how dangerous it is, you could, via dialogue options, try to negotiate a higher pay than what the contract giver has offered you. What we actually got, however, is simply a bar that you try to push as far to the right as possible before the arbitrary annoyance meter fills up, and honestly I have to admit I don't know what happens. It never happened to me. Not even close, even when I tried to really push my contract giver's patience. A similar scenario plays out when we come to the whole meat and potatoes of the Witcher work, that is, tracking down and identifying the monster. In theory, you could once again do something really nice here. You could follow the tracks or follow certain leads that Geralt picks up and comments upon, try to think a bit logically, and once you find some kind of mark, I don't know, scratch marks in a tree, or a really deep and clear footprint somewhere in the mud, or, very simple, a corpse of a human or a corpse of another monster, for example as I think it's the female griffin that the Nilfgaardians kill in the White Orchard section of the game. Where you then look at the corpse, Geralt makes analyses based on what you observe, and then you could have gotten, I don't know, 3 or 4 dialogue options that all would represent one of the possible interpretations, what kind of a monster you're dealing with. upon which Geralt could then base his preparations for. What we really get, however, is as far as the tracking goes, that usually you go to whatever quest marker the quest log sends you or the map sends you, then you hold down the right mouse button and follow the red glowing trail of generic footprints until Geralt comes across some arbitrarily determined spot and says, it's a drowner, or something along those lines. Even the aforementioned section where you analyze the dead griffin, which there are similar like those, very few and far between, but they exist. Ultimately, you do nothing there. You just click through all the options like look at the head, look at the body, look at the legs. Geralt will comment upon each and every single dialogue point, and then Geralt himself will, in place of you, determine what kind of a monster it is that you're dealing, or what the circumstances of the situation are if you already know the monster you're dealing with. Hell, even the bestiary is really fucking useless. As a little aside, I find it kind of ridiculous that in this game the bestiary still has to be once again filled up, especially given that in this game it is firmly established that Geralt has regained all of his memories. The bestiary should already be full. I shouldn't first have to kill like 5 different drowners before Geralt remembers, oh yeah, drowners, yeah, these things that I've been fighting my entire fucking life and that are more common than people in some areas. Instead, it should have been full and actually implemented into the part of the game where you track down and analyze the monster you're supposed to hunt. Instead, it just says, this monster is very vulnerable against Igni. And even when it comes to the preparations for the monster fight and the monster fight itself, the game is largely disappointing. Once again, there are a few quests here and there where Geralt actually has to set out lures or first gather some ingredients to pull up a trap that actually lures the monster in. But even those are rather bare bones and really don't involve much of the player actually playing the game. It's just one more step in which you have to follow the lead of whatever Geralt tells you needs to be done. Most of the times, however, you go somewhere, you click a button, or you go to a fucking campfire that just conveniently is in the area, you rest there for an hour, and then bam, monster appears, you slay it. The only effective part in terms of preparations comes in the form of blade oils and potions, which you can easily consume at any given time from your inventory, even in the middle of the fight, so not much of a preparation. Even the ultimate act of killing the monster and getting a trophy is kind of like an afterthought. Instead of actually having people react to you bringing a trophy in, maybe seeing the trophy presented in a village that you once freed later on in the game when you revisit it, you just have these intangible things nobody reacts to that give some minor, rather irrelevant bonus, like a slight increase of gold that drops from monsters. Again, it's there, it's nice that it is there. It is a slight visual variation because you hang it from your horse rather than from yourself like you did in The Witcher 2. But yeah, once again, there could have been done more with that. Now, some of you, while potentially agreeing with me on that point, might still say, okay, but so what? This is not unique. The Witcher 3 is far from the only game in existence where people have said, it would have been nice if the graphics would have been better, or if they had this and that game mechanic from another game. It's basically one of the standard quote-unquote complaints with video games, especially older ones, where we say, if this was included in that game, the game would have been better. What makes Witcher 3 stand out in that regard, and what also makes it uniquely frustrating to me, is that tools and the mechanics necessary to bring these improvements into the game are all there. The Witcher 3 is not a game that would have been better if some mechanics would have been included that aren't in the game. The Witcher 3 has these superior mechanics in them, has all the necessary tools to utilize them, in many cases even outright does utilize them in the ideal way, but just like a super weapon in a Star Trek episode, is immediately forgotten afterwards and never to be brought up again. The aforementioned village girls who gossip about the village witch are just one example, but you will hear even graver and more embarrassing examples later on when we're going to address the game's, game mechanics. But therein lies the big frustration with The Witcher 3. It's not that the game itself is bad, but as much as you might enjoy yourself playing it, if you pay even the slightest bit of attention, you can see a much, much better game just outside of reach. It's like a fucking mirage that's taunting you. And just to clarify, everything I just mentioned was just one example of how this is a weakness of the game. As I said before, this permeates every single facet of the game. In that particular regard, The Witcher 3 reminds me, if you recall, that infamous Verge PC build that was making the rounds on the internet years ago. You know, it's not like the PC was doomed to be a piece of shit. The components to build an extraordinary gaming PC were all there. It's just that the bumbling buffoon who put it together had no idea what he had there, had no idea how to put it together properly, so while he was spending his time looking into the camera and telling you how absolutely fucking amazing the new gaming PC is going to be, he's busy screwing a fucking 10 centimeter long screw with his Swiss Army knife into the wrong side of the fucking radiator. Only that instead of being mocked for completely mishandling the resources they have, CDPR instead got called the greatest game developer of all times, creating one of the, if not the greatest RPG of all times. What the fuck, people? Okay. Admittedly, that was a bit exaggerated. As I said, this is mainly just frustrating. It doesn't really make the game bad. You just wonder what it could have been. To summarize this section, the problem here really is that this shallow and unfocused game design resulted in a product that in no way, shape or form was actually deserving of the exaggerated amount of praise and awards that it eventually got. The shame, however, is the real problem here is that it could have easily been a game very well deserving of every praise it ultimately undeservedly received. Which I guess brings us to the first more specific problem of the game that I really want to dig in a little bit. And how do I put this kindly so that people will not overreact? The Witcher 3 is not an RPG. Yeah, remember how when at the beginning I said that you should put a pin into that comment about how I would recommend this game to fans of the genre? Yeah, the genre I had in mind was action adventures, because The Witcher 3, as I said, is not an RPG. And while I can appreciate that fans of The Witcher 3 or of the Witcher series in general are probably tired of hearing people proclaim that their favorite game/series isn't an RPG, I also think it's highly pertinent, especially now, given that CDPR's last PR debacle, which was Cyberpunk 2077, failed so hard in that particular regard, even they themselves had to remove the RPG tag from the game itself. And I find it kind of hypocritical that people can, although reluctantly, agree to that, but in the same breath try to defend The Witcher 3 as a full-blown RPG, despite this title having pretty much the same issues in that regard. Now, while a full-blown discussion about what makes or breaks an RPG would certainly go beyond the limitations of this video in particular, I guess we need some kind of a baseline upon which, you can understand why I come to the conclusion that I drew here. And in order to do that, I want to tackle a line or a pseudo-argument that gets bandied about a lot when it comes to pseudo-RPGs, but has also been used a lot when it comes to the defense of The Witcher 3 as an RPG. And that line is that The Witcher 3 is clearly a role-playing game because you're playing in the role of Geralt of Rivia. There are levels of self-delusions that you think would be impossible, but fine, whatever. This highly disingenuous statement is just a very convoluted rephrasing of the sentence, this game's player character is, in this case Geralt of Rivia. It's just reformulated in such a way that they could shoehorn the words role and playing into it to make it seem like they have an argument. And this flaw becomes readily apparent if you just follow it to its logical conclusion. Namely, that according to that standard, pretty much every, or I should say almost every video game that was ever made would be a role-playing game. I guess you want examples. Very well, StarCraft, the first one, would be a role-playing game by that standard. It's because you play in the role of a colonial magistrate of the Terran Empire, a newly created Cerebrate under the command of the Overmind, and a new and aspiring executor of the Protoss military, respectively. As a matter of fact, you are directly addressed, and you, I mean you as the player, are directly addressed as such, both in the mission briefings, as well as some conversations during the missions. The SimCity franchise, also apparently a role-playing franchise, since you're playing in the role of a city mayor. Hell, one of the earliest incarnations of the first SimCity game actually had full-blown FMV sequences in which actors portrayed the different heads of departments to address you as the mayor directly. The Doom franchise? Full-blown role-playing game again, according to this standard, because you play in the role of the Doom Marine in Doom 1 and 2, the Unnamed Space Marine in Doom 3, and the Doom Slayer in Doom 4 and Eternal. Hell, the latter two even have weapon customization, and if you're willing to stretch the definition far enough, and I know you people in particular love stretching out definitions, the achievements or the abilities that you unlock with the different challenges in Doom 4 could be seen as some form of perks, so I guess role-playing game, right? No, of course not. This is nonsensical. As I said before, this phrase really just means that you have a player character, and having a player character is not sufficient a qualifier for an RPG. What is a key element of any RPG is player control and or player agency, specifically control over the player character. Now I think it's worthwhile to mention that what I'm saying here is not only applicable to video games. This not only holds true for both forms of entertainment role-playing games, as in pen and paper and video games, this holds also true for psychiatric role-playing games, i.e. therapy, as well as erotic role-playing games. At the end of it all, role-playing games of any form aren't just about playing a character, but expressing yourself, expressing your ideas, your morals, your fantasies, your desires, whatever, through the lens of a fictional character. What would you be like if you were a very powerful, strong warrior in a fantasy setting? What would your actions be if you were a highly influential and politically powerful individual? A leader of a strong, successful company, a wizard, or fuck knows whatever you can think of. And that self-expression can only take place when you, as the player, have control or agency over your player character. Now that control can of course be exerted in numerous ways. Thinking about it, I would say that the most common or the best ways to categorize these different ways is number one, in appearance. How does your character look? How does he appear to the world? The character's personality and morality. What is he like? Is he aggressive? Is he passive? Does he have strong beliefs and morals, or doesn't he, and if not, why? As well as his attributes. Is he strong, charismatic, or intelligent? As well as his skills and abilities, or sometimes even more importantly, the lack of abilities and skills. What things can't your character do? And therefore, what kind of challenges will force your character to think outside of the box? Special mention should probably go to the point that is often brought up when it comes to defining RPGs, or a core feature of RPGs, which is choices and consequences. I am a bit hesitant of actually taking this all too seriously, simply because while it is used often in these discussions, it's also an incredibly vague term. If you choose to press the trigger in a first-person shooter, the consequence is that whatever is at the other side of your barrel will die. You know, choices and consequences, but that would barely qualify for defining an RPG, right? Hell, it would barely qualify for a fucking Telltale game. There is, however, a kernel of truth or a kernel of relevance in that whole choices and consequences. Because for an RPG to really be an RPG, any of the aforementioned aspects of control need to be met with acknowledgement of the game world. It's not just sufficient to give me the ability to design my character however I want. The world in which the character moves needs to react believably to my appearance and my personality, morality, etc., etc. It doesn't mean much if I can design every single pubic hair of my character, when ultimately every character treats me the same whether I run around in a tuxedo or whether I wear nothing but my underpants, a rainbow-colored afro, and a smile. Now, the same general principle, of course, can also apply on a gameplay level. Particularly, that means that if you choose to skill your character in a certain way or use certain weapons, that is accurately reflected in your gameplay style, meaning that if you go full plate armor and wield a halberd, your fighting style should not be the same as if you run around in nothing but cloth and wield two swords, as an example. Again, it's about making the choices, having consequences for these choices, and having these choices also acknowledged by the game world, or in this case by the game mechanics. Again, I understand this is a very cursory dive into what makes an RPG, but again, I need to keep this video under 3 days in duration. So that is the baseline under which I operate. And with that established, let's line up these aspects against The Witcher 3. How well does one of the greatest RPGs of our time actually fare when put up against the standard? Well, as you can probably already infer from my tone, not all that well. Right off the bat with appearances, we have very limited options. Now, that might rightfully be excused by the fact that Geralt of Rivia has always been defined appearance-wise, but not only are we limited to only choosing his hairstyle and his beard, the one cosmetic element that actually would allow us to, roleplay in any meaningful fashion has little to no impact. I am of course talking about the armor that Geralt can wear throughout the game. Now, on one hand, there are 3 armor classes, light, medium, and heavy, and in accordance with what I said before, it has little to no impact on your gameplay style. There is some slight negative effect on your stamina regeneration, and if you pick a particular skill in the general skill tree, you get a slight damage bonus. But ultimately, it doesn't influence Geralt's fighting style at all, what kind of armor you wear. And possibly even worse, there are specific armors that not only have a distinct look, they wear the colors of one of the major factions in the game. You can outright run around with Nilfgaardian armor, with the emblem of Nilfgaard on your bloody chest. You can run around with armor that bears the colors of Redania, and you can even get the armor of the witch hunters in the game. And never once does anyone, even for a second, react as you would expect it to be. Yeah, sure, you could say that some people will immediately look at Geralt's face and realize, oh yeah, that's that one witcher that's been running around the area for 5 days. But still, you would wonder why the fuck he's running around in the colors of your sworn enemies, right? Also, for fuck's sake, stop making excuses after the fact for the developer. Now, the solution of that is in plain view. The characters should really react to how your character is dressed, which is a mechanic that exists in The Witcher and exists in thousands of other games. And once again, and I try not to repeat myself too much, probably too late for that, but all the same, the game itself actually addresses that at the very beginning, or relatively close to the beginning, when you're brought to Vizima after finding or being found by Yennefer. The game gives you an entire section where the Nilfgaardians comment on how filthy you look, how you're not dressed properly, how you have to behave properly, right? And later on in the Skellige chapter, in what is actually a long-lasting unfixed bug that persists to this very day, when you attend the feast in honor of that Skellige ruler that dies or is sent off on a boat and you apparently knew, Yennefer makes a point out of remarking how she likes how you are looking with a fully grown out beard. Even if you explicitly made sure to be completely shaven before you attend the feast, or even before you meet her in Skellige itself. When it comes to customizing your appearance, the game offers you very little, and what little there is has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on the gameplay or the game in general. Now, when it comes to personality or morality, you would think that the game actually does a lot better there, right? Unfortunately not so much. While it is true that there are several choices that you can make during dialogue options and in the course of the story, and there's of course the usual rigmarole of monster hunting quests where you find out that the true monster are the humans after all of this falls firmly into the category of sounds nice on paper, but in practice, your choices, most of the times, even the heavy ones, bear minor short-term consequences at best, and most of the time, not always, but most of the times are immediately forgotten afterwards. This is also the reason why you can almost schizophrenically flip-flop between the kind-hearted humanitarian Geralt and the cold-hearted professional witcher Geralt who will kill monsters even if they themselves have not really done anything wrong. There really, once again, are no real actual consequences on the side of the game or the setting for however you want to play Geralt. And the same unfortunately holds true for Geralt's personality, such as it is. You have very little to no influence over what exactly Geralt's personality is. And in this case I can't even allow the character is predefined excuse. As I mentioned before, the Geralt of Rivia in the games is very different than the one in the books. And if you consider the general character arc throughout all three Witcher games, well, Geralt actually starts out The Witcher 1 with complete or almost complete memory loss, and only at the ending of The Witcher 2 does he claim to have fully recovered all his memories. So The Witcher 3 actually would have been the ideal point to allow the player to determine what kind of a person Geralt of Rivia had become after he lost his memory. He basically gets a chance at a fresh start, contrasting his old personality with the experiences that shaped him in the last however many years have passed since the beginning of the first game. Instead, once again, CDPR just takes the reins away from the player and says, no, this is how he's supposed to be, this is how he feels, and if you don't like it, well, tough shit. The solution for this problem would have actually been rather simple and could have been achieved with something as primitive as a simple numeric system. The RPG Vampire the Masquerade Redemption from 2000 actually had a solution like that, where there was, in accordance with the pen and paper, a humanity value, and depending on certain dialogue choices and actions you take throughout the game, your humanity score would either go up and down. And once you get towards the ending, certain actions, certain evil actions, would be unavailable if your humanity score was too high. Certain good actions would be unavailable if your humanity score was too low. And if you went too far into one direction or the other, the game would outright choose the good or evil ending for you. And once again, The Witcher 3 has something of the sort in it occasionally. The best example I can come up with is in the infamous relationship between Geralt and Yennefer, where if you follow one particular side quest, you can outright decide to say to Yennefer that your relationship with her is over and will not come back. And guess what? If you do that before you continue past a certain point in the main quest, certain interactions between Geralt and Yennefer that a romanceable Yennefer would allow will not occur or will be completely blocked by the game if you rejected her. So, a simple binary choice, which could have easily been embedded in the code of the game. So once more, we have the system in place, the mechanics of the system being relatively simple, but CDPR once again decided just not to do anything with that. Now, we do have somewhat of a deviation when it comes to attributes, as in that they're practically non-existent in the game. And yes, I'm aware that there exist damage stats and vitality, which is the only classical attribute in the game that exists, but it really is reduced to simply determining the amount of hit points you have before Geralt keels over. Aside from maybe crit chance, you have very little influence over the attributes in the game, and they in turn have very little influence onto your gameplay style, and they certainly have no influence in when it comes to any non-combat interaction with the world. You will never come into a situation where Geralt is just too weak to do something, or not dexterous enough to do something, or even not intelligent enough to do something. So Geralt's ability or inability to overcome any challenge that is presented to him outside of, of course, combat, is purely left to the whims of the storytellers in the game, where, for example, at one situation he is declared to be a really bad liar, and then at another occasion easily deceives someone. The closest thing to what the game does that would work as a solution is actually in the upgraded Axis sign, whereas if you unlock it, you can use the sign to convince people to do what you want. But even that is done on the very shallow level. Basically, instead of having to find a normal solution to overcome your problem, you can just press a button, and all it takes you is up to 3 skill points invested in one of the earliest magic skill tree skill perks available. But yeah, overall, the effect of attributes onto the game, especially when under the lens of role-playing criteria, are so negligible they may very well not exist. Which lastly brings us to skills and abilities, which in this game are expressed exclusively to the perk system. And I will admit, even I was almost fooled by this. First of all, because the perks are arranged in a typical classic skill tree fashion. It's not exactly designed like, for instance, the old skill trees many of you might know from original World of Warcraft and similar games, but the basic structure is the same. You have 3 different skill trees, each sectioned into different tiers, and in order to unlock the more powerful perks, you first have to invest a certain amount of skill points into the weaker perks in the tree. Even more importantly to me, however, or what actually contributed to me being almost fooled here, is that The Witcher 3 actually limits the amount of perks you can have active at any given time, namely up to 12, which means that you can't just gather skill points until the end of time and then turn Geralt into an omnipowerful super creature. Even if you unlock every single perk available, you have to select up to 12 specific perks you have active, and therefore, hypothetically, determine your playstyle. But as you can already tell from me using the term hypothetical here, there is a little problem, and the problem is that the perks are shit. Now don't misunderstand me, I'm not trying to say that the perks in this game do not have their use as far as, well, the gameplay mechanics are concerned. There are many useful perks in that regard. Funnily enough, some of the strongest are in the general tree, which honestly I think it's best if I don't even get into that one. It's just weird. But basically the general tree is full of 1-point perks, which range from filler to what the fuck were you thinking. As an example, there is one which turns basically every food item, which usually or normally heals you for a certain set amount for a very short amount of time, like 4 to 5 seconds, and actually lasts them for 20 bloody minutes, turning them into impromptu heal potions. Now, what I mean when I say that the perks in this game are shit, I mean that once again through the lens of them being role-playing elements. And I guess I could now go into several key perks and explain what they do, how most of the useful perks are nothing more than percentual damage increases, and that's it. But I think the best way to demonstrate why I find these things lacking is to just present to you the different play styles and how choosing each of those trees as your primary tree affects, or rather doesn't affect, your way of playing the game. First, the combat tree. If you decide to focus Geralt mainly on the combat tree, then your swords will be your main source of damage, as your perks will focus mainly on increasing the damage of each and individual swing of yours. Your signs you will use mostly in order to supplement your sword fighting, as well as exploit specific weaknesses of certain monsters. You will use your bombs for pretty much the same effect, and you will take potions to temporarily boost your stats, and use blade oils to improve your damage against specific monster types, which you will mostly use when you're facing a particularly or exceptionally stronger variant of said monster. Now, as a magic-focused Geralt, your main source of damage will still be your swords. It's just, that you will have more variety in your signs, which, honestly, you still mainly use to supplement your sword fighting, but you now have a more varied tool set to supplement your sword fighting and exploit the specific weaknesses of certain monsters. You will still want to use your bombs for pretty much the same effect, and you will still drink potions in order to temporarily boost your stats, and you will still use blade oils to defeat exceptionally strong variants of specific monster types. Lastly, the alchemy tree, which was the one I picked first for my first playthrough. As an alchemy-focused Geralt, you will, well, still rely mostly on your swords for your damage. You will still use your signs to supplement your sword fighting and to exploit the specific weaknesses of certain monsters. You will still use your bombs, which may be more numerous now and do slightly more damage, for pretty much the same effect. You will still drink potions in order to temporarily boost your stats, although temporarily now means a lot more time. And you will still use your blade oils to boost your damage against exceptionally powerful variants of specific monsters. And you may also get a slight defensive bonus for the specific monster to which the blade oil in question applies. Now, with this example, the issue should be very apparent, right? It doesn't really matter in which direction you skill Geralt, he ultimately will always fight the exact same way. Even when it comes to boosting specific things, like for instance crit chance, right? You would think, okay, I go into the combat tree and I pick certain perks that increase my crit chance or my crit damage. That would be a fair enough argument if I didn't have similar perks in other trees. As a matter of fact, the general tree kind of sabotages that distinction even more, because there is a general talent that makes your adrenaline increase your crit chance. So all the perk system ultimately does is just add a slightly minor variation of, well, taste to essentially the exact same playstyle all over again. Which is why even during my testing of those 3 different skill trees, I had to change neither my playstyle, nor my general approach to combat, and certainly not my equipment. And once again, the solution to this problem is fairly obvious and, again, is pretty much implemented into the game. It's just, in this particular case, it is mind-boggling how they could have fucked this up so much. So, to keep this as short as possible, I will simply name 1, maybe 2 examples for each skill tree and how they could have made each skill tree far more unique and therefore varied the playstyle. In the combat tree, they could have actually allowed us to unlock certain combat moves, sword fighting moves, that the other trees wouldn't have had access to. The easiest solution? Allowing us to block or even parry monster attacks. Usually a very bad idea, because in the best case it will get you staggered, and in the worst case you just reenacted a scene from Last Action Hero.
This is gonna work. It's a movie. I'm a good guy. This has got to work. Oh shit! I'm a comedy sidekick!
But a version of Geralt that is focused on sword fighting could have gathered so much experience that they could actually parry the attacks of even inhuman creatures. Hell, you could even extend it so far as to allow us to dismember monsters in very specific ways, therefore allowing us to rob them of special attacks. If you consider that an oddly specific example, that's because it is. There is actually a monster hunting quest in, I think, even one of the earliest villages you come across once you enter the main part of the campaign, in which you're about to hunt a grave hag, which uses her tongue as some kind of poisonous whip. And, just as I described, if you parry her attack with the right timing, you cut off her tongue, therefore robbing her of that specific attack. Now, when it comes to the magic tree, you might be tempted to think that they already did this. After all, the 3rd tier of the magic skill tree already allows you to access varied or alternative modes of each of the signs. And while that is certainly a point I would be willing to debate, ultimately it once again all amounts to nothing more than a slight variation of what is already in there. I mean, if I set my enemies on fire with a fire blast or a fire stream is just splitting hairs. Instead, I would have imagined something like reflecting Geralt's deeper understanding of magic, maybe allowing him to combine the effects of different signs. For instance, by creating first an Irden circle, which of course would be bigger as you are more versed in magic, and then set enemies on fire while they stand within that circle, the burning duration of your Igni is prolonged. You could combine Ard and Igni, for instance, whereas usually using Ard on any fire source would extinguish that fire source, Geralt's stronger grasp on magic would allow him to fan the flames of his Igni, therefore increasing the fire damage. Just basic ideas like that. And again, all of that is possible with the mechanics the game demonstrates. We do have slow motion, we do have the extension of effects. All of that is mechanically in the game, it just would have needed to be applied to the spell effects of your signs. And as far as the alchemy tree goes, that one might even be the biggest waste of potential. Not only would that tree have allowed you to, with the superior game mechanics of The Witcher 3, bring in a far more useful variant of the completely nonsensical traps from The Witcher 2, you could have allowed us to really delve into the alchemy aspect, just plagiarize the fucking alchemy system from Skyrim. Allow us to maybe combine certain potions. If you discover that you will mostly use the potion that increases your stamina and your attack damage, why not allow alchemy-focused witches to combine those two into one potion, therefore including the quick slot system more into the active gameplay loop? Or if all of that is just too complicated for you, here's a very easy idea. Every single bomb and every single potion and every single blade oil has an enhanced and a superior version of itself. Just lock those behind specific perks deeper in the alchemy tree. And don't tell me you don't want to do this, because as I mentioned before, the variations of the signs are locked in tier 3 of the magic tree. In summary for this category, all I can really say is that while CDPR has gone through great lengths to keep up the appearance of an RPG, but once you get down to it and analyze it to the nitty-gritty details, despite the constant claims of CDPR to the contrary, what they created with The Witcher 3 ultimately was not an RPG, but an action-adventure. Which again is not a sin in and of itself. Action-adventures can be really good games, just look at the bloody Soul Reaver games. But I find it a disservice to any actual genuine RPGs and the studios that put in that additional legwork that true RPGs require to pretend otherwise. And with that, I guess we come to the final big issue I have with The Witcher 3, and that is the main storyline. Now I want to clarify right from the get-go that what I'm going to talk about here is going to be specifically towards the main storyline, meaning the story of the titular Wild Hunt, as well of course the events that are primarily focusing or centering around Ciri. I want to be this specific because most of the side quests, again, not all of them, many of them are hit or miss, but a vast portion of the side quests are actually, everything you would expect from quests in a game like this. They can be funny, they can be dramatic, they can be entertaining in all kinds of ways, and are generally well done. Now, what I'm talking about is specifically the narrative that drives the main plot of this single-player action-adventure that The Witcher 3 is. And, well, not surprising probably at this point, but it's a fucking failure. Now, I really want to make clear, the main storyline of The Witcher 3 is bad. Like, impressively bad. Because it fails on pretty much every conceivable level a video game narrative could fail. So, similar to the previous sections, let's start with a rather general point before we go into the specifics. And the general issue I see with the narrative here is the usual suspect of the attempt of a cinematic experience. To me, it has been a long-term running gag that modern video game writers really are just failed Hollywood producers or Hollywood directors, and who boy does The Witcher 3 fit that bill to a T. As the optics over reason or substance approach to video game storytelling is borderline omnipresent here. Now, one of the most common expressions of the cinematic experience in video game design is, of course, when the designers have a very specific vision in their mind, and of course, because the player can't be relied upon to do exactly what the grand visionary behind the screen wants to happen, they'll just wrest control away from you and present the resulting mini-movie as, well, a cinematic experience. One of the many examples for this is in one of the earlier Ciri flashbacks where Ciri actually fights a basilisk alongside the Bloody Baron. You actually start fighting the beast only for a cutscene to interrupt you mid-fight so that CDPR can show you a scene where Ciri precariously balances on the neck of the beast and kills it in a flashy fashion, and that flashiness, that supposed badassery, of course excuses that interruption of gameplay, right? No, of course not. This is a video game, it's an interactive experience, let me kill the beast. And if you don't want me to do that because it destroys your artistic vision, at least have the decency to keep the entire fight a cinematic, so I know that I can go to the kitchen and get me a drink in the meantime. The sad thing about this approach is that usually, at least in my opinion, it fails, because the aforementioned basilisk scene is far less impressive to me than when a random bunch of drowners attack me, I distract one by setting it on fire, then sidestep in the right timing the other one who's leaping at me, and then bifurcating the beast like an overexcited child trying to take apart a Thanksgiving turkey. But the biggest collection of these cinematic experience sins is actually, and sadly, the dramatic climax of the storyline, namely the battle at Kaer Morhen. Jesus fucking Christ, where do we start with this one? Essentially, if you can think of an overused cinematic trope in video game narratives, it's present and accounted for here. Like, for instance, excessive and needless slow-motion scenes in the name of badassery or menacing appearances that make absolutely no sense if you actually put a second of thought into it. Example? Well, what about the moment when the Wild Hunt finally breaches the gates of Kaer Morhen and every single one of the major defenders is frozen, completely unable to do anything, including Geralt of Rivia, whom the Wild Hunt knows and the leaders know personally. Well, they walk by them, in slow motion, very menacingly, without doing anything to him whatsoever. Alright? And then there's of course cheap emotional manipulation instead of actually evoking emotions by, creating a decent dramatic scene. And the best, or I should say worst example for that is the death of our beloved Vesemir. But Headbiter, how can you say that? I almost cried when I saw Vesemir die. It was a deeply emotional scene. No, it was a fucking stupid scene that was framed competently. The music, the camera angles, the dying words of Vesemir, which starts with a pretend criticism of Ciri and then an almost gasped admission of affection, immediately followed up, of course, with our all-time favorite, the no moment. Unfortunately, if you put the slightest amount of critical thought into this scene, it really becomes one of the dumber scenes in video game narrative history. I mean, sure, if you are willing to step into the territory where fans make excuses for the writer's shoddy craftsmanship, you can probably come up with reasonably good explanations why Vesemir knew who Imlerith was, that Imlerith is a hothead, and that stabbing the guy in the arm with a butter knife would enrage him so much that he would immediately break his neck. But A, once again, stop making excuses for shoddy work, and B, even beyond that, something that Vesemir could have not predicted at all is the reaction. Like, tell me what the fuck was he going for there? He certainly couldn't have predicted that Ciri would fall into a fucking avatar state where she just exudes enough power to suppress the Wild Hunt without actually killing the Wild Hunt and without actually killing all her allies right there, which either scenario would probably ended the story right then and there. Now, maybe he wanted to remove himself as a hostage, but to what end? After all, the entire castle was full of hostages, including Ciri's adoptive father and mother, which the game until this point went out of its way to establish that Ciri really loves. Or did he try to encourage her to run away? Okay, but what would that have achieved? After all, then she would be right back at square one, and the Wild Hunt would still have a smorgasbord of really effective hostages right there, so the fuck was this scene about? Well, to once again repeat myself, shallow design without any substance. They wanted a dramatic scene, they wanted the death of the mentor moment, but they didn't bother to actually put any work into it, so they went with the painting by numbers approach. Now, as we get into the more specific points that I see wrong with the narrative of the main storyline of The Witcher 3, I originally wanted to start out with the protagonist, but I realized that I can't really do that without first tackling the eponymous Wild Hunt, the big antagonist teased from the very first game on. Well, turns out the Derp Hunt would probably be a better title for them, because what a fucking letdown. And for once, I think that this section will not be all that controversial, because from what I gathered, the Wild Hunt did not score many points with the Witcher audience, and understandably so. Essentially, that big spectral army that has haunted Geralt since he was found in the woods has been turned into just another faceless army that looks spooky and does want to do bad things. Essentially, the Wild Hunt consists, for storytelling purposes, out of an endless amount of warriors and 3 people. The paladin, Eredin, the warrior, Imlerith, and of course the sorcerer, Calanthir. And truth be told, I'm not even sure if I remember those names correctly, because as characters, they left absolutely no impression with me. Which is kinda disastrous, especially for the latter two, since they are introduced in this game. Now, the main character of Eredin, the leader of the Wild Hunt, that is actually a major fuck up on the side of CDPR, because we've encountered this guy and spoken to him even in the earlier sections of the very first game. And I think the main issue is that Eredin has been completely demystified. Starting out as a philosophizing antagonist just a step behind Geralt, hunting him wherever he goes in an intangible fashion, to basically just a guy with a skull mask on who looks supposedly threatening. I rather think he looks like an extra from the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And I honestly can't tell why they would do that. Why would they turn Eredin into essentially just a health bar that Geralt has to beat down at the end of the game, and stop portraying him as an antagonist who actually has his own ideas and values and engage in discussions about good and evil, chaos and order, how the white-haired albino spell sword protagonist always seemed to barely elude death, but in doing so essentially dooms his closest friends, allies and lovers to an early tragic death. Cheap shots against the Witcher franchise as a whole aside, the problem with the Wild Hunt is that it's essentially devoid of character. Not because they couldn't have made it out of something, in fact there is a storytelling hook presented that unfortunately is never explored or exploited, but as it stands, the Wild Hunt is just a faceless army with 3 leaders that are completely devoid of character, and as if to add insult to injury, they're also some of the worst fights in the entire fucking game, amounting to little more than really poorly done Dark Souls bosses. I guess Imlerith has a bit of character, but unfortunately his character is being a fucking dumbass, because immediately after losing a major battle, he decides to abandon his army and expose himself to an attack by Ciri and Geralt, because he wanted to do implied sexual things with some succubi? Yeah, way to undermine the credibility and threat of your main antagonist there, game. And since the Wild Hunt is the driving force behind the main storyline, the plot itself also suffers from this. Now, right off the gate, with Ciri being constantly pursued and we're being constantly told that she's in danger and we need to hurry up, The Witcher 3 commits this old narrative sin of creating a time-sensitive main plot and then outright forces you to engage in entire weeks' worth of side quests and gathering quests. Now granted, this is one of the numerous weaknesses the game has that isn't Witcher exclusive, but actually that makes it worse, because after being criticized over and over and over again for doing shit like this, you would think that someone in the industry would finally learn their lesson. But another problem is that, well, the narrative doesn't line up with what you observe in the game. Like just before I mentioned that there actually is a story hook presented in the game for why the Wild Hunt is after Ciri. Well, spoiler alert, I guess. But the Wild Hunt wants Ciri because of her inherent ability to easily open stable portals and being able to determine exactly where she goes. That is important, supposedly, to the elves and the Wild Hunt by extension, because their world is dying, about to be enveloped by the White Frost. The problem with that story hook is that throughout the entire game, and once again specifically when it comes to the Battle of Kaer Morhen, the elves seem to have absolutely no problem with opening countless portals all throughout the world, whenever they need it, in fact. The only thing that stops them is if some mage like Yennefer creates some anti-portal force field. I don't fucking know, but essentially, unless someone actively tries to stop them, the Wild Hunt seems to be capable of being everywhere in the world, with an entire army no less, and basically no costs whatsoever. Something similar happens way later in the game, when one of the main story quests leads you to the world of the elves, where you have to convince what is basically the elves' mayor to stop sending reinforcements when Eredin demands them. And yeah, you succeed in that, and the game once again tells you, yes, there will be no more reinforcements for Eredin when he needs them, but then you still have this major league battle with an entire army, which, again, I know that the one doesn't necessarily contradict the other, but you don't really get the impression that you achieved anything there. You're just being told, this happened, so you better believe it. No, this is not how you tell a story in a fucking video game. Hell, this is not even how you tell a story in a bloody movie or a book. The solution for this particular dilemma, again, I have to give credit to my wife, would have been to push the entire Kaer Morhen section very far to the beginning of the game. You know, Ciri appears, warns Geralt that there's no time for a lovely reunion because the Wild Hunt is right on her heels, will probably appear in a few days' time and they can track her down. So they flee to Kaer Morhen, gather whatever allies they can find on the way, and barely manage to defend themselves or fend the Wild Hunt off. Then we learn that they still can track Ciri, but because opening portals is really hard for them, even with all their mages, it will take several weeks, maybe months, to actually open another portal, but this time they will come with an army and far better prepared. So Geralt can ride out into the landscape and spend how much time ever exploring the world, doing side quests, gathering equipment, gathering further allies, fortifying the position, and actually leading to a satisfying battle to fend up that ultimate enemy. Maybe with some more dialogue or interaction, you know, actual interesting storytelling. But CDPR couldn't do that in years of development time with God knows how many writers, and it would have actually taken care of many of the issues I just mentioned. Which I guess brings us to the trouble of the game's protagonist. Now, the game's protagonist is of course Geralt of Rivia. In fact, CDPR has repeatedly insisted that this is the third and final installment of the saga of Geralt of Rivia. Now, they formulated this very specifically, so even back then I suspected they wanted to continue the Witcher franchise. They just wanted to focus on different characters than Geralt, and, you know, while I was piecing this video together, they actually teased a new game, which I guess from what I gathered is about the School of the Lynx, involving the character of Lambert and Kira Metz. We'll see where this is going, but just as an aside, this video, while it was produced, suddenly became much more relevant. But as far as Geralt in The Witcher 3 is concerned, while he is undoubtedly the protagonist of the game, he really isn't the protagonist of the story. Yes, the main storyline of Witcher 3 The Wild Hunt is not about Geralt of Rivia. It's not even about Geralt of Rivia's relationship to the eponymous Wild Hunt. He doesn't even really drive the main events of the storyline in any meaningful fashion. Essentially, he is reduced to an errand boy. He chases after a phantom for the first third to half of a game, then gets sent around at the command of people who actually are involved in the main storyline, then has to gather some allies for a combat whose outcome is predetermined and ends the same way regardless of how successful he is, and then his biggest contribution towards the climax of the game is how much of a bloody emotional support he has become to the actual protagonist of the storyline. Essentially, the Witcher Geralt of Rivia is reduced to nothing more than an errand boy and a fucking cheerleader. Which, you know, quite frankly, I can't see how you could make this good, but, you know, let's assume that someone could create actually a game where this kind of character being the main character would work. But here it can't work because, as I said before, this game was always promoted to be about Geralt of Rivia. And we learn nothing about him. His character remains the same throughout the entire game, and we don't even get to explore his relationship with the eponymous Wild Hunt, which you would think would be a topic here, but instead it is revealed that every interaction he had with the Wild Hunt, all the mysteries established in The Witcher 1 and especially at the end of The Witcher 2, just amount to, well, really, the Wild Hunt wanted Ciri. Geralt was just, a means to an end. It is then no surprise to me that when it comes to the end of the story of Geralt of Rivia, most even hardcore fans of the Witcher franchise will rather think of the ending of the DLC content of Heart of Stone and Blood and Wine, which, regardless what you think about these add-ons gameplay-wise or story-wise, are at the very least about the fucking protagonist that you as the player control. Now, as you can already guess from a rant so far, the actual protagonist of the game's story is Cirilla. Something unpronounceable bullshit. And guess what? She's terrible too. And just as the plagiarism accusation towards the Witcher franchise, I understand perfectly well that the term of the Mary Sue gets basically thrown around like cheap confetti. But once again, I can't help but being honest here, and not only is Ciri a Mary Sue character, she's a borderline textbook Mary Sue character. She checks all the boxes with little to no ambiguity whatsoever. What seems to be a primary criteria for Mary Sue characters, for instance, that everything she tries comes easy to her, is proven at several occasions throughout this game, but we actually get a taste of that in Geralt's dream sequence at the beginning of the game. Now, some of you might argue that, oh, this was just a dream, it doesn't reflect reality, and that Geralt even remarks upon that fact, but that's exactly the thing. Geralt remarks upon the elements that simply weren't true, like Yennefer never having been to Kaer Morhen before, or the attack of the Wild Hunt. But he makes no remark whatsoever about how supernaturally talented Ciri is, where even as a child, she wheel carts from post to post at the edge of a cliff while wielding a wooden sword against a giant pendulum while being blindfolded, and when she loses her sword she immediately catches it with her foot without losing her balance, and then she would have presumably flown off to save Narnia while simultaneously discovering a new prime number. And the fact that Geralt doesn't bring this up in his conversation with Vesemir, to me is proof enough that this is actually an accurate representation of how Ciri was as a child. And I remind you, because I have the feeling that many people who defend this character aren't consciously aware of that fact, Ciri never, and I mean never, not even in the respective so-called Witcher ending of the game, ever becomes a full-blown Witcher. Oh, she becomes famous as a Witcher if you go down a certain path in the story of the game, but she never undergoes the trial of the grasses. She's never granted the supernatural speed, strength, and endurance and resistance to poison that makes Witchers, what they are supposed to be. But she still is capable of all these magnificent physical feats, not to mention her intellect and her supposed charisma, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, as with many especially modern Mary Sue characters, the writers try to implement some weaknesses to counter the rather shallow accusation that everyone who doesn't have weaknesses is a Mary Sue character. The problem is that just as the weaknesses you are supposed to mention in a job interview, like being too punctual or being too perfectionist or not being able to leave a project unfinished, the weaknesses for Ciri are really strengths that are disguised as weaknesses. In Ciri's particular case, she's just too caring. And don't confuse this with being too naive. There are characters like that, but she's just too good-natured. She can't stand it when people put their lives on the line for her. She just can't bear that. She's also way too powerful, even for herself. This is in fact a repeated motive in the story of Ciri, that supposedly her powers are so great that she can't even control them. Yet, she lacks the training so far. Which kind of bleeds over into what I mentioned before. The game tells us that things are one way, but
Note, Ciri, you are not ready. You do not control your powers.
If what we see in the game qualifies as not being able to control her powers, I'm genuinely curious to see what her being in control would do. But if for any external reason she can't overcome an issue, then outside forces will just conspire to grant her what she wants. You can see this in the aforementioned scene in Kaer Morhen, where she just single-handedly suppresses, but doesn't kill, the Wild Hunt, because then the story would be over. You can also see it in the revenge plot towards Imlerith, as well as, well, what I consider to be an involuntarily funny scene towards the end of the game in the battle in Skellige. Also in line with typical character traits for a Mary Sue, the writers at CDPR try to implement certain elements into Ciri that are supposed to make her more sympathetic to us, but ultimately just make her even more obnoxious than she already is. In Ciri's case, that is that she's burdened with being a highborn, super talented individual, and it's just such an emotional burden for her that people only like her because of her superpowers, and always expect her to do things because of her superpowers. Well, a few things about this. First off, well, yeah. I mean, you're blessed with cosmic level powers that allow you to solve several continental scale issues with nary a thought. So I'm not entirely sure why you are surprised about people caring mainly about that element of your personality. Secondly, to be honest, you don't offer much in terms of alternative. Seriously, what is there to Ciri other than her being the special and her being annoyed about being the special? And it's not even like people single her out of a selection of potential chosen ones. By chance or fate, she happens to be the only creature in the multiverse who can actually solve the issues at hand. So, yeah, I'm sorry that we don't appreciate you for your whopping 2 character traits there, Shinji, but if you don't do what seems to be your role preordained by fate, everyone will die, so priorities? And lastly, and this is where we come back to another trait of the Mary Sue, that statement just is outright false. People everywhere appreciate Ciri for being Ciri. Everywhere she goes, she makes friends. She befriends within a very short time barmaids, a wandering circus. Even people who haven't seen her for decades are still remembering her really fondly. Yeah, they say that, oh, she's kind of stubborn, which even in and of itself isn't all that much of a flaw, and in this context really is just a code word for she's self-confident and knows what she wants to do. Again, strength declared as a weakness. But pretty much everyone who interacts with her remembers her fondly and is even willing to throw their lives on the line for her sake. Hell, the only character that I can recall that isn't outright declared a villain who actually doesn't like Ciri is nameless she-elf number 4 in Avalok's Secret Laboratory, and quite frankly, the way she voices her criticism, she's just plain and simple jealous of Ciri because of all the attention Avalok gives her for virtue of being born. Hell, even Emeva Emreis, who is supposed to be this neglectful father, demonstrate that he ultimately does care for Ciri on a personal level. He just doesn't show it due to his personality and his position. And to top this all off, she isn't even really allowed to fail in any scenario. I think I already mentioned before that basically the protagonist of the game, Geralt, is reduced to a cheerleader whose only purpose is to emotionally support Ciri. But even if you intentionally fail in that particular regard, Ciri still fulfills her purpose of stopping the White Frost. Her success in this regard is guaranteed. The only question is whether she survives her heroic deed. And this is speculation, and I'm fairly certain it has been debunked so far, but I bring it up here anyway because I find it hilarious that even Witcher fans speculated about this being a real possibility. See, because it is never really explicitly stated that Ciri dies, Geralt says it in the bad ending, but he has no way of knowing that. Some fans speculated that Ciri really just felt unloved after defeating the White Frost, whatever that entailed, and then just pissed off to some other world. Which means she just abandons everyone and drives her adoptive father to suicide by monsters, potentially, again, simply because he wasn't supportive enough. So in the end, not only did CDPR shift the focus of the main storyline from the actual protagonist to their own character that we barely get to play. When we play her, she's actually just a one-click jerk-off character. But for all the attempts at CDPR's part to make her likable, in the end she's just a whiny, spoiled brat. Which, funnily enough, is the reason why in my second actual playthrough I will make damn sure that Geralt will romance Triss. First of all because I can't stand Yennefer, but that's another topic in and of itself, which I won't mention in this video, don't worry. But because I know that in the Blood and Wine expansion towards the end, depending on your choices in the main game, the story, the overall story will conclude with you being visited either by the sorceress that you romanced, or if you didn't romance either of them, you will be visited by either Ciri or Dandelion. And I honestly cannot tell you which one of the two is worse. I mean, I've explained in detail why I don't think Ciri is a likable character, but Dandelion isn't all that much better. He's a whoremonger, he's a liar, as a friend he's an absolute useless bag of shit. In contrast to how people like to frame him, he's actually not a womanizer, he's just an abusive asshole. And even as a bard, his chosen profession, quite frankly, I mean, some people proclaim sometimes that he's good, but more often than not, and this is actually verified by what we can see of him, he's a worse bard than Cacophonix from the Asterix comics, for crying out loud. Which brings us to the final part of this section of the video, namely the ending, the White Frost. Which may surprise you as a talking point in the story section, but if that's the case, well, it's fitting, because the White Frost as an actual story element pretty much slaps you in the face towards the end of the game in pretty much the same way. Granted, yes, the White Frost is repeatedly mentioned throughout the entire franchise. There is even, I'd say, extended discussions about the White Frost, but it's always this threat in the background. We know that Ciri is supposed to take it on sometime, but the way they decide to tackle it is the most rushed dogshit I've ever seen. Basically, you have this finals battle in Skellige, you dispatch of Calanthyr, about whom you learned nothing other than, you know, he's the mage of the group, and he was once a student of Avalok, which does nothing, really. Also, he basically disposed of Geralt twice in the most bitch-get-out-of-my-way fashion imaginable. Then you kill Eredin, who tries to sow distrust between you and Ciri, which, okay, nice try. And then suddenly, monsters appear everywhere. You discover that there's a new conjunction of the spheres. You and Yennefer ride to this tower that, up until then, has no actual interactivity to it. Trust me, I tried. Then Ciri gives one of the most condescending speeches to the person that she supposedly loves and whose decisions are supposed to make her feel loved and cared for.
Didn't think it worthwhile to tell me? Warn me of your plans?
I'm sorry, I know, I should have. I feared you'd not understand.
Soka.
And then Ciri walks into a white screen and that's it. And the worst part about this all is that this major arcane threat of the White Frost that marks both Ciri's destiny as well as her chance to finally be free of said destiny is essentially just climate change. Now, I know how you're looking at me right now, but I'm not being facetious. Shit, that's essentially what it is. You can go up to the Witcher wiki and read it up yourself. The White Frost is essentially just a magically induced ice age that travels from dimension to dimension and consumes world after world. So Ciri's grand fate at the end of the day is just to protect the multiverse from an ice age, which means that Vesemir gave his life to protect us from climate change.
How dare you!
And with that, we have reached the end of my criticism of The Witcher 3. Now, there are of course numerous more issues with the game that one can examine, or, dig deeper into the issues I've brought up so far. But I'm already beyond the time limit I set myself, so I guess it's time to wrap things up. So at the end of this all, the big question that arises is, what did we learn? What is the big lesson at the end of it? Did you just listen to me for 1.5 hours, venting my frustrations with a game that is nowhere near as good as it should have been? Well, yeah, that, in all honesty, was a major motivation for me to do this video, but you remember how I promised you that there was a little bit more to it than that, much earlier in the video? Yeah, as a matter of fact, I pretty much already did tip my hand on that in one point. But I let you stumble across it yourself. Just take a step back, remove all the Witcher-specific elements here, and really ask yourself if the points I brought up as major criticisms of The Witcher 3 doesn't remind you of another recent game. A game that's trying to pass itself up as an RPG, but doesn't live up to that standard. A shallow perk system that ultimately is irrelevant. Little to no control over your character, the setting, or even the story. And what little there is ultimately boils down to nothing more than window dressing or a mirage. That one of the biggest choices you can actually make in the game is with which character you're going to have sex with. And of course the fact that the main story is, maybe not exclusively, but seems at many points primarily to be not about the character that you created and that you play, but rather an overly self-indulgent, self-insert character from the side of the studio. If I then add that the studio in question would be, well, the very same one that made The Witcher 3, it should be obvious where I'm going with this. Yeah, big M. Night Shyamalan twist here. This entire critique can double as a cursory critique of CDPR's design in Cyberpunk 2077. Because as I was putting together the material for this video, I realized that partially by the footage I saw myself, partially from the experience that friends and acquaintances online presented to me over the last several months/years, that CDPR essentially made all the same mistakes they made in Witcher 3 all over again, only this time the switch in setting, background, and of course not having 2 games preceding this one to establish all of that in advance, robbed 2077 of the safety net that Witcher 3 ultimately had, and which in my opinion largely saved Witcher 3 from becoming a similar PR disaster as 2077 did. And there is a good reason why I want to close this video that is mainly about the bad design choices in The Witcher 3 with a reference to Cyberpunk 2077. Because while I make no secret out of the fact that my frustration with the dropped potential of The Witcher 3 was a major motivator for me making this video, basically just venting this frustration, I also think that the aforementioned parallels between the last 2 CDPR games are indicative of a deeper problem, because creating a product that doesn't live up to fan expectations is not unusual and can be partially blamed on the fans and their expectations themselves. Having all the necessary ingredients to actually fulfill these expectations and even exceed them, then dropping the ball with that project is very frustrating, far less common, but I guess still excusable. But to repeat the same set of mistakes twice in a row and apparently learning nothing from the experiences, that points to a far deeper and far more significant issue on the side of the developer. Now here again, of course, someone could take a deep dive and identify far more problems. Personally, for instance, I think that this culture of forced positivity that seems to pervade every facet of the gaming industry, including, of course, gaming journalism, which includes, by the way, so-called independent YouTube content creators, can also be blamed because, if you always hear that you're doing everything right, then why would you fix your product, which supposedly is already near perfect? But that topic is a pit all of its own, so I'll stop my little rant here. I hope that I, at the very least, could entertain you, and who knows, maybe I can even hope to have left you with something to think about for yourself. And likewise, if you have any feedback to leave me something to think about, as usual, you're very welcome to do that. One way or another, I hope you're having a great time, and I see you next time once again with a game review video. that is much, much shorter than this one. See you around.
This is my story, not yours. You must let me finish telling it.